William Tecumseh Sherman, February 1820, February 14, 1891, was an American soldier, businessman, educator, and author. He served as a general in the Union Army during the American Civil War, earning recognition for his command of military strategy, but criticism for the harshness of his scorched earth policies, which he implemented in his military campaign against the Confederate States. British military theorist and historian B.H. Liddell Hart declared that Sherman was the most original genius of the American Civil War and the first modern general. Born in Lancaster, Ohio, into a politically prominent family, Sherman graduated in 1840 from the United States Military Academy at West Point. In 1853, he interrupted his military career to pursue private business ventures, without much success. In 1859, he became superintendent of the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy, now Louisiana State University, but resigned when Louisiana seceded from the Union. Sherman commanded a brigade of volunteers at the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861, and then was transferred to the Western Theater. He was stationed in Kentucky, where his pessimism about the outlook of the war led to a breakdown that required him to be briefly put on leave. He recovered and forged a close partnership with General Ulysses S. Grant. Sherman served under Grant in 1862 and 1863 in the Battle of Fort Henry and the Battle of Fort Donelson, the Battle of Shiloh, the campaigns that led to the fall of the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, and the Chattanooga Campaign, which culminated with the routing of the Confederate armies in the state of Tennessee. In 1864, when Grant went east to serve as the general-in-chief of the Union armies, Sherman succeeded him as the commander in the Western Theater. He led the capture of the strategic city of Atlanta, a military success that contributed to the re-election of President Abraham Lincoln. Sherman's subsequent famous March to the Sea through Georgia and the Carolinas involved little fighting but large-scale destruction of military and civilian infrastructure, a systematic policy intended to undermine the ability and willingness of the Confederacy to continue fighting. Sherman accepted the surrender of all the Confederate armies in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida in April 1865, but the terms that he negotiated were considered too generous by U.S. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who ordered General Grant to modify them. When Grant became President of the United States in March 1869, Sherman succeeded him as Commanding General of the Army. Sherman served in that capacity from 1869 until 1883 and was responsible for the U.S. Army's engagement in the Indian Wars. He steadfastly refused to be drawn into party politics. In 1875, he published his memoirs, which became one of the best-known first-hand accounts of the Civil War.
Early life. Further information: John Sherman birthplace. Sherman was born in 1820 in Lancaster, Ohio, near the banks of the Hocking River. His father, Charles Robert Sherman, a lawyer who was a justice on the Ohio Supreme Court, died unexpectedly of typhoid fever in 1829. His widow, Mary Hoyt Sherman, remained with 11 children and no inheritance. 9-year-old Sherman was raised by a Lancaster neighbor and family friend, attorney Thomas Ewing. Ewing was a prominent member of the Whig Party who became U.S. Senator for Ohio and the first Secretary of the Interior. Sherman was a fifth cousin 3 times removed of U.S. Founding Father Roger Sherman. Sherman's older brother, Charles Taylor Sherman, became a federal judge. One of his younger brothers, John Sherman, was one of the founders of the Republican Party and served as a U.S. representative, senator, and cabinet secretary. Another younger brother, Hoyt Sherman, was a successful banker. 2 of his foster brothers served as major generals in the Union Army during the Civil War: Hugh Boyle Ewing, later an ambassador and author, and Thomas Ewing, Jr., who was a defense attorney in the military trials of the Lincoln conspirators. Sherman's niece, Euthanasia Sherman Meade, was a pioneering woman physician in California. Names: Sherman's unusual given name has always attracted attention. One 19th century source, for example, states that General Sherman, we believe, is the only eminent American named from an Indian chief. According to Sherman's memoirs, he was named William Tecumseh because his father had caught a fancy for the great chief of the Shawnees, Tecumseh. However, Lloyd Lewis's 1932 biography claimed that Sherman was originally named only Tecumseh and that he acquired the name William at the age of 9 or 10, when he was baptized as a Catholic at the behest of his foster family. According to Lewis's account, which was repeated by later authors, Sherman was baptized in the Ewing home by a Dominican priest who found the pagan name Tecumseh unsuitable and instead named the child William on the saint on whose feast day the baptism took place. Sherman had already been baptized as an infant by a Presbyterian minister, and recent biographers believe, contrary to Lewis's claims, that he was probably given the first name William at that time. As an adult, Sherman signed all his correspondence, including to his wife, W.T. Sherman. His friends and family called him Cump.
Military training and service. Senator Irving secured an appointment for the 16-year-old Sherman as a cadet in the United States Military Academy at West Point. Sherman roomed with and befriended another important future Civil War general for the Union, George Henry Thomas. Sherman excelled academically at West Point, but he treated the demerit system with indifference. Fellow cadet William Rosencrans remembered Sherman as one of the brightest and most popular fellows at the Academy and as a bright-eyed, red-headed fellow who was always prepared for a lark of any kind. About his time at West Point, Sherman says only the following in his memoirs. At the Academy, I was not considered a good soldier, for at no time was I selected for any office, but remained a private throughout the whole 4 years. Then, as now, neatness in dress and form, with a strict conformity to the rules, were the qualifications required for office, and I suppose I was found not to excel in any of these. In studies, I always held a respectable reputation with the professors, and generally ranked among the best, especially in drawing, chemistry, mathematics, and natural philosophy. My average demerits per annum were about 150, which reduced my final class standing from number 4 to 6. Upon graduation in 1840, Sherman entered the Army as a second lieutenant in the 3rd U.S. Artillery and saw action in Florida in the Second Seminole War. In his memoirs, he noted that it was a great pity to remove the Seminoles at all, as Florida was the Indians' paradise, and still had, at the time that Sherman wrote his memoirs in the 1870s, a population less than should make a good state. Sherman was later stationed in Georgia and South Carolina. As the foster son of a prominent Whig politician, in Charleston, the popular Lieutenant Sherman moved within the upper circles of Old South society. While many of his colleagues engaged in the Mexican-American War, Sherman was assigned to administrative duties in the captured territory of California. Along with fellow Lieutenants Henry Halleck and Edward Ord, Sherman embarked from New York City on the 198-day journey around Cape Horn aboard the converted sloop USS Lexington. During that voyage, Sherman grew close to Ord and especially to the intellectually distinguished Halleck. In his memoirs, Sherman relates a hike with Halleck to the summit of Corcovado, overlooking Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, to examine the city's aqueduct design. Sherman and Ord disembarked in Monterey, California on January 28, 1847, 2 days before the town of Yerba Buena acquired the new name of San Francisco. Sherman and Halleck lived in a house in Monterey, now known as the Sherman Quarters, from 1847 to 1849. In June 1848, Sherman accompanied the military governor of California, Colonel Richard Barnes Mason, to inspect the gold mines at Sutter's Fort. Sherman unwittingly helped to launch the California gold rush by drafting the official documents in which Governor Mason confirmed that gold had been discovered in the region. At John Augustus Sutter Jr.'s request, Sherman assisted Captain William H. Warner in surveying the new city of Sacramento, laying its street grid in 1848.
He also opened a general store in Coloma, which earned him $1,500 in 1849, while his Army salary was only $70 a month. Sherman also earned money from surveying and by the sale of lots in Sacramento and Benicia. Even though he earned a brevet promotion to captain in 1848 for his meritorious service, his lack of combat experience and relatively slow advancement within the Army discouraged him. Sherman would eventually become one of the few high-ranking officers of the American Civil War who had not fought in Mexico.
The day the Thunderbolt fell. In late 1943, over occupied France, a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt of the U.S. 56th Fighter Group, one of the most powerful piston-engine fighters of the war, was hit by anti-aircraft fire during a bomber escort mission. The pilot, First Lieutenant William Roach, tried to nurse the damaged plane home, but oil sprayed across his canopy and the engine seized. With no choice left, he crash-landed in a field near Caen. German soldiers surrounded the smoking wreck and captured Roach, but their real prize was the aircraft, an almost intact P-47 Thunderbolt, codenamed Razorback. For the Luftwaffe's engineers, this was gold. The German High Command immediately ordered the wreck to be shipped to the Rechlin Test Center, the Luftwaffe's top-secret aircraft research base near Berlin. They wanted to know, what made this American monster so fast, so tough, and so deadly? The Jug arrives in Germany. By late November 1943, the P-47 arrived at Rechlin under heavy guard. It was unlike any German fighter the engineers had seen. They were used to sleek, narrow designs like the Bf-109 or FW-190, optimized for agility and climb. But this American fighter was enormous. Its fuselage was wide and thick. Its wings looked heavy, almost clumsy. The Germans even laughed at first. One engineer called it eine fliegende Badewanne, a flying bathtub. Yet that laughter quickly faded when they began taking it apart. Engineering wonder. Inside the P-47's massive cowling sat the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower. It was the same engine that powered the F-6F Hellcat and later the F-4U Corsair, both legends of the war. But what truly astonished the Germans was what came after the engine, a turbo-supercharger system unlike anything they'd seen before. The system used a complex network of ducts, intercoolers, and exhaust-driven turbines to maintain power at high altitudes, even above 30,000 feet. Whereas German fighters lost performance as they climbed, the P-47's power actually increased. As one Rechlin report later summarized, this is a flying fortress in single-seat form. No German engine installation approaches its sophistication. The Turbo-Supercharger Revelation. The turbo-supercharger was a masterpiece of American engineering. Its exhaust-driven turbine compressed intake air before it entered the engine, a system that required precision metallurgy, heat-resistant alloys, and mass production quality that Germany simply could not match under wartime constraints. To replicate it, they would have needed an entire new industrial base. Dr. Hans Meyer, one of the lead engineers at Rechlin, reportedly told his team, "They don't build airplanes, they build machines of war." The Germans had relied on mechanical superchargers, simpler, engine-driven compressors. Efficient at low altitudes, yes, but they choked at high flight levels. The American solution was heavy, complicated, and costly, but it worked, and it gave Thunderbolt pilots a massive advantage in Europe's high-altitude air battles. The armor. Surprise. When engineers inspected the cockpit, they found another mystery: armor plating everywhere. German fighters like the Bf-109 had thin protection, a single armored headrest, and a small steel plate behind the seat. But the Thunderbolt's pilot sat inside a steel bathtub. The sides, bottom, and back of the cockpit were reinforced with bulletproof steel and plexiglass. They realized that even 20-millimeter cannon shells could struggle to bring one down unless they hit vital systems directly.
As one Luftwaffe pilot later said, "You could empty your guns into it and it would still come home." The firepower. Then came the guns. 8.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, capable of firing over 7,000 rounds per minute combined. The Germans calculated the weight of fire and realized the P-47 could unleash more lead in a few seconds than an entire flight of Bf-109s. This was terrifying. One German test pilot, Oberleutnant Hans-Werner Lerch, who later flew the captured Thunderbolt, wrote, "Its firepower is devastating. Against our fighters, a single burst would destroy wings or engines. Against bombers, it is lethal." The flight tests. Once repaired and repainted in Luftwaffe markings, yellow tail, black crosses, the P-47 was flight tested under the designation T9 plus LK. Test pilots quickly realized that, despite its bulk, the Thunderbolt was surprisingly stable and smooth. It could dive faster than any German aircraft, up to 500 miles per hour in a near-vertical plunge, without losing control. In contrast, the FW-190 and Bf-109 would begin to compress and shake violently at those speeds. Lerch wrote in his flight report, "Its dive speed is unmatched. No German fighter can follow it. If pursued, it dives away like a rock and lives to fight again." This was a revelation, and it explained why German pilots complained that Thunderbolts vanished into the clouds during combat.
A weapon of the industrial age. When German engineers completed their study, they presented their findings to the Luftwaffe High Command. Their conclusion was blunt. The Thunderbolt represents industrial warfare. It is not designed by pilots, but by engineers with limitless factories. The report noted that while the P-47 was not the most agile fighter, it was the most survivable, powerful, and well-engineered single-seat aircraft in the world. The Luftwaffe couldn't match it, not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked America's vast resources. The P-47's design was heavy, inefficient, and complex by European standards, yet backed by the industrial muscle of the United States, it was unstoppable. When power meant victory. By 1944, the P-47 was everywhere, escorting bombers over Germany, strafing trains, and diving through flak to attack tanks. Its nickname, the Jug, became a symbol of indestructibility. Thunderbolt pilots could take hits that would have torn any other plane apart. One pilot returned with a 3-foot hole in the wing and oil pouring from the engine, and still landed safely. When German engineers compared their best fighter, the FW-190A8, they admitted, "The Thunderbolt's power plant alone weighs more than our entire front fuselage and produces more thrust. They had never seen such power before."
Legacy of the Jug. By the end of the war, over 15,600 P-47s had been built, one of the largest fighter production runs in history. It could escort bombers, dive bomb, strafe tanks, or climb to meet enemy jets. In total, P-47s destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft and tens of thousands of ground targets. German test reports after the war were found by Allied intelligence. Their verdict was clear. It is not elegant. It is effective. It is America in the air.